When 12-year-old Emma's pilot parents suddenly collapse unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning mid-flight, she faces an impossible choice: wait to crash or use the secret aviation knowledge she's been hiding for years. Air traffic controllers are stunned when a child's calm voice says, "I've got the controls." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small municipal airport as 12-year-old Emma Mitchell climbed into the back seat of her family's Cessna 182 Skylane, her worn backpack stuffed with a tablet, headphones, and the latest fantasy novel she'd been devouring. She settled into the familiar leather seat that still smelled faintly of aviation fuel and old coffee, buckling her seatbelt with practiced efficiency while her parents conducted their pre-flight checks outside. Through the window, she watched her father, Captain David Mitchell, methodically inspect the aircraft's exterior with the same careful attention he'd demonstrated on hundreds of flights before, his hand running along the wing's leading edge checking for any irregularities. Her mother, Laura Mitchell, a licensed commercial pilot herself, stood near the propeller examining the engine cowling, her clipboard in hand as she verified each item on their checklist with professional precision. Emma had grown up in the cockpit, spending countless weekends accompanying her parents on flights across the region, initially sleeping through most trips as a toddler, then gradually becoming aware of the complex dance of switches, dials, and radio communications that transformed a stationary machine into something that defied gravity. Her parents had always treated these flights as family adventures, pointing out landmarks below, letting her feel the gentle vibrations of the engine through her seat, occasionally allowing her to hold the yoke during straight and level flight while her father kept his hands ready to take control. What they didn't know was that Emma had been absorbing everything, not as passive entertainment but as serious study, watching her father's hands move across the instrument panel, listening to every radio call, memorizing the cadence of communications with air traffic control, noting how her mother cross-checked instruments and called out airspeeds during approaches. During the past 3 years, Emma had secretly borrowed her father's pilot training manuals from his home office, reading them late at night under her covers with a flashlight, studying chapters about aerodynamics, weather theory, navigation, and emergency procedures with an intensity that would have surprised her parents had they known. She'd downloaded a free flight simulator on her tablet, spending hours practicing takeoffs, landings, and emergency scenarios, her fingers dancing across the screen as she visualized herself in the left seat making decisions that kept imaginary passengers safe. She'd watched hundreds of hours of aviation YouTube channels, listening to experienced pilots explain complex procedures, discuss accident investigations, and demonstrate proper techniques for handling equipment failures. Her parents thought she was playing games or watching cartoons on her tablet during long car rides, never suspecting their daughter was mentally rehearsing emergency checklists and practicing radio phraseology in her head. The cockpit door opened and her father climbed into the left seat, his familiar smile creasing his weathered face as he glanced back at her and asked if she was ready for another boring flight to Grandma's house. Emma returned his smile and nodded, keeping her expression casual while internally cataloging everything he did as he settled into position, adjusting his seat, fastening his 4-point harness, and beginning the interior pre-flight checks. Her mother occupied the right seat moments later, organizing charts and inputting their flight plan into the GPS while making small talk about what they'd have for dinner that evening. Emma opened her book to a random page, establishing the appearance of a disinterested passenger absorbed in fictional adventures, while actually watching her father's reflection in the window as he methodically worked through the startup checklist. The engine coughed to life with a rattling roar that settled into a smooth rumble, the propeller spinning into an invisible disc that created shimmering distortions in the air ahead. Emma felt the familiar vibration through her seat, the sensation she'd known since childhood, as her father tested the magnetos, checked the oil pressure, and verified all instruments showed proper indications. Her mother contacted ground control requesting taxi clearance, her professional voice crisp and clear through the radio, receiving instructions to taxi to runway 27 via taxiway Alpha. The aircraft began rolling forward, the nosewheel steering responding to her father's feet on the rudder pedals as they navigated the narrow taxiways between other parked aircraft, the wingtips clearing obstacles with practiced precision. At the runway hold short line, her parents performed their final checks, testing flight controls, verifying flap settings, reviewing their takeoff briefing, and confirming they were ready for departure. Her mother keyed the microphone and announced they were ready for takeoff, receiving immediate clearance from the tower controller, who sounded bored with the routine Saturday morning traffic. Her father advanced the throttle smoothly, the engine's roar increasing to a powerful crescendo that pressed Emma back into her seat as they accelerated down the centerline, the white dashes becoming a blur beneath them. She watched the airspeed indicator climb through her position between the front seats, noting when it reached rotation speed, feeling the moment her father applied gentle back pressure, and the rumbling ceased as they lifted cleanly into the morning air. The ground fell away beneath them as they climbed through 1,000 feet, then 2,000, the airport shrinking to toy-like dimensions while the city spread out in all directions like a living map. Emma maintained her appearance of reading while actually listening to every radio call, every adjustment her parents discussed, every small decision they made as they leveled off at their assigned cruising altitude of 7,500 feet. Her father engaged the autopilot once they were established in cruise flight, the aircraft settling into smooth flight that required only monitoring rather than constant control inputs. Her mother pulled out a magazine, the routine nature of this familiar flight requiring less attention than usual, while her father adjusted the fuel mixture and verified their GPS was tracking properly toward their destination 200 miles north. Emma had actually read the weather briefing her father printed that morning while he was making breakfast, noting the clear skies, light winds, and perfect visibility that promised an uneventful flight. She'd glanced at the fuel calculations on his planning sheet, verifying mentally that they had adequate reserves for the trip plus required safety margins. She'd noticed he'd filed for 7,500 feet, an appropriate altitude for their northbound direction according to the hemisphere rules she'd memorized from the flight training manuals. All of this knowledge remained her secret, something she'd never shared with her parents because she didn't want them to worry about her becoming obsessed with aviation, didn't want them to think she was trying to grow up too fast, didn't want to face their concerns about whether flying was really appropriate for someone her age. 40 minutes into the flight, cruising smoothly through clear air with visibility extending to the horizon in every direction, Emma noticed her father shift uncomfortably in his seat and press his hand against his temple. She looked up from her book with genuine concern as he mumbled something to her mother about having a headache, reaching for the water bottle in the side pocket of his door. Her mother turned to look at him with a frown, asking if he was feeling all right, her own voice sounding slightly strained in a way that made Emma's stomach tighten with the first whisper of concern. Her father assured her mother he was fine, probably just needed some water and maybe they'd been climbing too fast earlier, though Emma knew their climb rate had been completely normal and well within the aircraft's capabilities. Minutes later, her mother reached up to adjust the air vents, mentioning that she was feeling oddly tired and wondered if they'd gotten up too early that morning. Emma watched with growing alarm as her father's head began to droop forward slightly before he jerked it back up, shaking his head as if trying to clear fog from his mind. Her mother asked again if he was okay, her words coming slower than normal, and Emma realized with sudden horrible clarity that something was seriously wrong with both of her parents simultaneously. She'd read about carbon monoxide poisoning in one of her father's safety publications, how the colorless, odorless gas could incapacitate pilots without warning, how it could affect everyone in an aircraft at the same time, how it was one of the most dangerous threats in general aviation because victims often didn't recognize what was happening until it was too late. Emma's heart began hammering in her chest as she leaned forward between the seats, calling to her parents with increasing urgency as her father's eyes rolled back slightly and his head lolled to the side. Her mother tried to reach for the controls but her hand moved sluggishly, missing the yoke entirely, her words slurring as she attempted to say something that came out as incomprehensible mumbling. Within seconds that felt like hours, both of Emma's parents had slumped forward in their harnesses, completely unconscious, their bodies held upright only by their seatbelts while their heads hung forward at unnatural angles. The aircraft continued flying straight and level on autopilot, the engine humming smoothly, the instruments all showing normal indications, everything appearing completely routine except for the fact that both pilots were incapacitated and a 12-year-old girl was now the only conscious person aboard. Emma's first instinct was to scream, to cry, to shake her parents awake, to make this nightmare stop being real. Her hands trembled violently as she reached forward to touch her father's shoulder, calling his name over and over with no response except the slight movement of his head as she jostled him. She could see his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, confirming he was still alive, but he was completely unresponsive to her increasingly desperate attempts to wake him. Her mother was equally unconscious, her face pale and her breathing barely visible. Emma felt panic rising in her throat like a physical thing trying to choke her, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of the situation crashed over her like an avalanche. She was alone in an airplane at 7,500 feet with both pilots unconscious and nobody who could help her except herself. For several long seconds, Emma simply froze, her mind overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening, by the certainty that she was just a kid who had no business being in control of an aircraft, by the knowledge that they were going to die because there was nobody qualified to land the plane. Then something shifted inside her, some combination of all those hours studying flight manuals, all those simulated emergencies she'd practiced on her tablet, all those years of watching her parents handle aviation challenges with calm professionalism. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, took a shaky breath, and made a decision that went against every instinct telling her she was too young, too inexperienced, too scared. She was going to fly this airplane, and she was going to save her parents, because the alternative was dying without even trying. Emma unclipped her seatbelt with hands that still shook but were beginning to steady, squeezing between the front seats into the narrow space between her unconscious parents. She carefully maneuvered her father's limp body to the side, trying not to think about how wrong it felt to be moving him like a heavy object rather than the strong man who'd always protected her. She slid into the left seat, her feet barely reaching the rudder pedals, her view of the instruments partially blocked by the yoke until she adjusted the seat height using the control she'd watched her father use countless times. The autopilot was still engaged, still flying the aircraft on its programmed course, but Emma knew from her studying that autopilots could fail, that they wouldn't help her land, that eventually she was going to have to take manual control and do things she'd only practiced in simulation. Before touching anything else, Emma forced herself to think about the carbon monoxide that had poisoned her parents, knowing that the same gas could be affecting her too, that she might only have minutes before she also lost consciousness. She reached up to the environmental controls and twisted all the air vents to maximum, then opened the small storm window beside her, cracking it just enough to allow fresh air to rush into the cockpit. The sudden blast of cold air hit her face like a slap, but she welcomed it, knowing that ventilation was her only defense against the invisible gas that had taken down her parents. She began taking deep, deliberate breaths of the fresh air streaming in, trying to flush any contamination from her lungs while keeping her mind focused on the immediate tasks ahead. The radio crackled with routine traffic from other aircraft, pilots checking in with air traffic control, requesting altitude changes, reporting positions, all of them completely unaware that a small Cessna in their airspace was being flown by nobody except a terrified 12-year-old girl. Emma knew she needed to contact someone, to tell someone what had happened, to get help from people who actually knew how to handle emergencies like this. Her hand moved toward the radio, then hesitated as fear gripped her again. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was joking? What if hearing a child's voice on the radio made them panic and give her bad instructions? She pushed those thoughts away and reached for the microphone, pressing the transmit button with a thumb that wanted to shake but that she held steady through sheer force of will. Her voice came out surprisingly calm given the hurricane of terror in her chest, using the phraseology she'd heard her parents use thousands of times, declaring an emergency in clear, simple terms that cut through all the routine radio chatter like a knife. She stated their aircraft call sign, reported that both pilots were unconscious, and said in words that felt surreal coming from her own mouth that she was 12 years old and the only conscious person on board. The radio went completely silent for several seconds that stretched into eternity, and Emma wondered if they'd even heard her, if the transmission had somehow failed, if she was truly alone with no help available. Then the controller's voice came back, professional but with an undertone of disbelief, asking her to confirm that she had said both pilots were unconscious and that she was 12 years old. Emma confirmed the information, her voice steadier now as she fell into the rhythm of radio communication, answering the controller's questions about her parents' condition, the aircraft's current status, whether she could see any instruments or knew how to operate the radio. She described how both her parents had collapsed within minutes of each other, how they were still breathing but completely unresponsive, how the autopilot was currently flying the plane but she didn't know how long that would last. The controller, a veteran with 23 years of experience who had handled everything from engine failures to terrorist threats, later said that hearing that child's voice calmly reporting an impossible situation was the most surreal moment of his entire career, something his training had never prepared him for because it wasn't supposed to be possible for a 12-year-old to be flying an aircraft alone. The controller's voice took on a different quality as he realized this was real, that a child was actually in command of that aircraft, that he was now responsible for guiding her through an emergency landing that represented her only chance of survival. He asked Emma her name, then began speaking to her directly, telling her in a calm, reassuring voice that they were going to work together to land the airplane safely, that he was getting help from experienced flight instructors right now, that she wasn't alone even though it felt that way. Emma felt some of the crushing weight lift slightly from her shoulders as she heard the confidence in his voice, the certainty that they could do this together, the absence of panic that helped her believe that maybe this impossible situation had a solution. The controller asked Emma what she could see in front of her, and she began describing the instrument panel using terminology she'd learned from her secret studying, identifying the altimeter showing 7,400 feet, the airspeed indicator reading 112 knots, the heading indicator showing they were flying north, the fuel gauges showing about a third remaining in each tank. The controller was stunned by her knowledge, asking her how she knew all these instruments, and Emma briefly explained that her parents were pilots, that she'd been flying with them her whole life, that she'd been watching and learning even though they thought she was just a passenger. She didn't mention the hours of simulation practice or the stolen training manuals, those details weren't important right now when the only thing that mattered was getting this aircraft safely on the ground. A new voice came on the radio, introducing himself as Captain Richards, a retired airline pilot and flight instructor who'd been rushed to the air traffic control facility to help guide Emma through the landing. His grandfatherly voice immediately made Emma feel slightly less alone, as he began asking her questions to assess her actual knowledge versus what she might have simply memorized without understanding. He asked her to look at the attitude indicator and describe what it showed, then to check the vertical speed indicator, then to find the throttle and tell him what position it was in. Each answer came quickly and accurately, and Captain Richards felt both relief and amazement that this child actually understood the instruments she was describing, that somehow she'd acquired real aviation knowledge that might make the impossible slightly more possible. Captain Richards explained to Emma that they were going to work together step by step, that he wouldn't ask her to do anything she wasn't ready for, that the first priority was just keeping the airplane flying straight and level while they figured out the best plan. He asked if she thought she could disengage the autopilot and take manual control, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the autopilot disconnect button that she'd watched her father press hundreds of times. Taking manual control meant becoming fully responsible for the aircraft, meant that her hands and feet would be directly connected to the control surfaces keeping them airborne, meant crossing a line from terrified passenger to actual pilot even if she had no license or legal authority to be flying. Emma's hand moved to the disconnect button and paused there while she took several deep breaths, then pressed it firmly. The autopilot disengaged with a subtle change in the forces on the yoke, which now moved freely under her hands rather than being held rigidly by the servo motors. The aircraft immediately began a gentle bank to the left as Emma overcorrected, her heart leaping into her throat as the horizon tilted in the windscreen. Captain Richards' calm voice talked her through recovering to level flight, reminding her to make small, gentle inputs, to think of the yoke as something delicate that responded to whispers rather than shouts. Emma forced her death grip on the yoke to relax, made tiny adjustments, and felt an enormous surge of accomplishment when the artificial horizon showed level flight again, when the turn coordinator showed zero bank, when she realized she was actually flying the airplane. For the next 10 minutes, Captain Richards had Emma practice basic aircraft control while maintaining their altitude and heading, learning how the airplane responded to her inputs, building the muscle memory that would be essential during the landing. Emma climbed and descended a few hundred feet, turned gently left and right, adjusted the throttle to see how it affected airspeed, and gradually began to feel less like she was wrestling with the controls and more like she was communicating with the aircraft. Captain Richards praised each successful maneuver, his voice warm with genuine pride, telling her she was doing better than some of his actual student pilots, that her parents had clearly passed on their natural feel for flying. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her parents, who still hung unconscious in their seats, whose lives depended entirely on whether she could do something she'd never actually done before. The air traffic controller had been coordinating with emergency services, diverting Emma toward the nearest airport with the longest runway, alerting fire and rescue equipment to stand by, clearing all other traffic from the area to give Emma the entire airport for her landing attempt. Captain Richards explained that they were going to guide her to Riverside Municipal Airport, which was now only 25 miles ahead of her, where a nice long runway with no obstacles was waiting for her to land. He asked if she'd ever practiced landings on her simulator, and Emma admitted she had, hundreds of them, though she knew that touching a screen was nothing like actually feeling the aircraft settle onto pavement with her parents' lives in the balance. As they approached the airport, Captain Richards began talking Emma through the landing procedure step by step, starting with reducing power to begin a descent, then configuring the aircraft with the first notch of flaps, then slowing to the proper approach speed. Emma's hands moved across the panel with increasing confidence born from all those secret hours of study, finding the flap control exactly where she knew it would be, reducing the throttle smoothly while keeping the aircraft's nose from pitching down too steeply, trimming the elevator to reduce the control forces exactly as she'd read about in the pilot's operating handbook. Captain Richards continued his steady stream of guidance, confirming each step, correcting minor errors before they became major problems, painting a mental picture of what she should see out the windscreen as the airport came into view ahead. Emma spotted the airport at her 12 o'clock position, the long gray runway looking impossibly small from her current altitude, and she felt her confidence waver as she realized she had to somehow align this aircraft with that narrow strip and touch down gently enough to keep everyone alive. Captain Richard sensed her hesitation through the radio and immediately began talking her through it, reminding her that thousands of pilots land airplanes every single day, that she'd practiced this maneuver in simulation, that he was going to be with her on the radio for every second of the approach. He told her not to worry about making a perfect landing, that the runway was 10,000 feet long and if she just got the airplane on the ground anywhere on that pavement they could celebrate regardless of how smooth or rough the touchdown felt. The tower controller cleared Emma to land on any runway she wanted, adding that emergency equipment was standing by and that she should take all the time she needed to get established on approach. Emma chose runway 9 because it aligned best with her current heading, requiring less maneuvering to intercept, and began following Captain Richards' instructions to turn onto a long final approach. She descended through 3,000 feet, then 2,000, the runway growing larger in her windscreen but still looking terrifyingly narrow compared to the vast expanse of farmland spreading out in all directions. She added another notch of flaps as instructed, felt the aircraft slow and pitch down slightly, compensated with a touch of back pressure and a small power increase, and was amazed when Captain Richards told her she was doing perfectly. The ground rose up to meet her as she descended through 1,000 feet, trees and buildings becoming larger, individual cars visible on the roads, the airport environment filling more of her windscreen. Emma's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, her palms sweating on the yoke despite the cool air still blasting through the storm window. Captain Richards told her to add the final notch of flaps, to reduce power to slow down more, to aim for the numbers painted on the runway threshold. Emma complied with each instruction, fighting the urge to rush or to hesitate, trusting the voice on the radio that had guided her this far and that wouldn't abandon her now when the moment of truth was seconds away. The runway filled her windscreen as she crossed the threshold at 50 feet, then 40, then 30, and Captain Richards told her to reduce power to idle and begin raising the nose slightly, flaring the aircraft to arrest the descent rate before touchdown. Emma pulled back gently on the yoke, felt the aircraft respond by pitching up, heard the decrease in wind noise as their forward speed bled off. The ground rushed up to meet them and Emma instinctively pulled back more, holding the aircraft in the flare attitude as the main wheels contacted the pavement with a firm but survivable thud that jarred through the entire airframe. She heard herself gasp as the nosewheel settled onto the runway, and suddenly they were rolling down the centerline, still moving fast but definitely on the ground, definitely safe, definitely alive against all reasonable odds. Emma remembered the brakes from her father's explanations, pressing the tops of the rudder pedals to slow the aircraft, feeling the deceleration press her forward against her harness. The airplane slowed to taxi speed, then to a walking pace, and Emma's legs were shaking so badly she could barely keep her feet on the pedals. Captain Richard's voice came through the radio filled with emotion, telling her she'd just done something absolutely incredible, that she'd saved 3 lives including her own, that he'd never been more proud of someone he'd never met. The tower controller added his congratulations, his professional composure cracking slightly as he told Emma that emergency vehicles were approaching to help her parents. Emma brought the aircraft to a complete stop on the runway and sat there with her hands still gripping the yoke, unable to quite believe that they'd actually made it, that her parents were still breathing, that the nightmare was over. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft within seconds, their flashing lights painting the cockpit in alternating red and white. Paramedics rushed to extract her unconscious parents while other emergency personnel helped Emma out of the pilot's seat, her legs barely holding her weight as the adrenaline that had sustained her suddenly drained away, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. A kind firefighter wrapped a blanket around her shoulders even though the day was warm, recognizing the signs of shock that came after surviving something traumatic. The paramedics worked quickly on her parents, providing oxygen through masks that covered their faces, checking vital signs, loading them onto stretchers for immediate transport to the hospital. One paramedic told Emma that her parents would likely be fine, that carbon monoxide poisoning was serious but treatable if caught in time, that her quick action to ventilate the cockpit and land the aircraft had saved their lives by getting them to medical care before permanent damage occurred. Emma watched the ambulance drive away with her parents inside, escorted by police vehicles with lights flashing, heading toward help that would reverse the invisible poison that had nearly killed them all. Later that evening, sitting in a hospital waiting room wrapped in clothes someone had brought her because her own were still in the aircraft, Emma learned that investigators had found the source of the carbon monoxide leak in a cracked exhaust manifold that had been slowly poisoning the cockpit throughout the flight. Her parents would make a full recovery after spending time in a hyperbaric chamber that accelerated the removal of carbon monoxide from their blood, and doctors said that without Emma's intervention they would have died still strapped in their seats, the aircraft eventually running out of fuel and crashing into farmland below. The FAA representative who came to interview Emma about the incident couldn't quite process what he was hearing as this small 12-year-old girl described using proper aviation procedures to execute an emergency landing that many licensed pilots would have struggled to complete. When her parents finally regained consciousness the next morning, groggy and confused about why they were in a hospital, Emma sat beside their beds and told them everything that had happened. She watched their expressions cycle through disbelief, terror at what could have happened, and finally overwhelming pride as they realized their daughter had possessed not only the knowledge but the courage to save them when they couldn't save themselves. Her father cried as he held her hand, telling her she was the bravest person he'd ever known, that he couldn't believe she'd learned so much just by watching them over the years. Her mother asked why Emma had never told them she was so interested in aviation, and Emma admitted she'd been afraid they'd think she was too young, that they wouldn't take her seriously, that they'd tell her to focus on being a kid rather than studying something as serious as flying. Her parents looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that came from years of partnership, then back at Emma with matching smiles. Her father told her that anyone who could land an aircraft after both pilots became incapacitated was definitely not too young to pursue aviation seriously, that they would fully support her getting proper flight training, that she'd already proven she had what it took to be an exceptional pilot. Her mother added that being young didn't mean being incapable, that Emma had demonstrated better judgment and composure under pressure than pilots with thousands of hours of experience, that the aviation world would be lucky to have someone with her skills and temperament. The story of the 12-year-old girl who saved her parents by landing their aircraft after they collapsed spread quickly through the aviation community and eventually into national news. Emma found herself uncomfortable with the sudden attention, the interviews and camera crews, the way people called her a hero when she'd just been trying to keep her parents alive. Captain Richards came to visit her at the hospital, this grandfatherly figure who'd guided her through the impossible, and he told her that what made her special wasn't just the aviation knowledge she'd acquired but the character she'd demonstrated by staying calm when terror would have been completely justified, by trusting her training when doubt would have been easier, by deciding to try when giving up would have been understandable. Several months later, Emma began formal flight training with Captain Richards as her instructor, and he privately told her father that Emma was by far the most naturally talented student pilot he'd ever taught, that she had an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that usually took years to develop. Emma approached her training with the same quiet intensity that had characterized her secret studying, but now she had her parents' full support and encouragement as she worked toward the pilot's license she couldn't actually receive until she turned 17. She flew regularly with her father and mother once they were medically cleared to return to cockpits, and the dynamic between them had shifted from protective parents and precious daughter to three pilots who shared a passion for aviation and a profound respect for what Emma had accomplished when it mattered most. The Cessna 182 was repaired and returned to service after the exhaust system was completely replaced and additional carbon monoxide detectors were installed throughout the cabin. The first time Emma climbed back into that aircraft, now sitting in the right seat as her father's co-pilot rather than a passenger in the back, she felt a complex mixture of emotions as she looked at the instruments that had been her only reference during the emergency, the yoke that had felt so foreign in her hands, the runway numbers that had grown so large in the windscreen as she fought to execute that first landing. Her father asked if she was okay, if being back in the aircraft bothered her, and Emma shook her head while reaching for the checklist, ready to get back to the business of flying rather than dwelling on what could have been. Years would pass before Emma fully processed the magnitude of what she'd experienced that day, before she could talk about it without feeling the echo of that terror that had gripped her when both parents collapsed, before she could acknowledge how close they'd all come to dying in a crashed aircraft because of a mechanical failure that gave no warning. She went on to become a professional pilot herself, eventually flying for a major airline, and she made a point of telling every student she instructed about the importance of being observant, of studying continuously, of preparing for emergencies even when they seemed impossible because aviation had a way of presenting impossible situations that demanded immediate competent response regardless of age or experience level. The air traffic controller who first heard Emma's voice declaring an emergency kept a recording of those radio transmissions, playing them occasionally for training purposes to illustrate how important it was to remain calm regardless of how unusual a situation seemed, how crucial it was to treat every pilot with respect whether they were airline captains or 12-year-old girls, how effective communication could make the difference between tragedy and survival. Captain Richards often told the story of guiding Emma through that landing during safety seminars, using it to emphasize that aviation knowledge came from many sources and that anyone willing to study and learn could develop the skills necessary to handle emergencies if they found themselves in command whether planned or not. Emma's parents never took flying for granted again after their brush with carbon monoxide poisoning, never assumed that routine flights couldn't become emergencies without warning, never treated their daughter as just a kid who needed protection rather than a capable individual with her own competence and potential. The experience fundamentally changed their family dynamic in ways both obvious and subtle, creating a bond forged through shared trauma and miraculous survival that lasted throughout their lives. They flew together often over the following decades, three pilots who understood that aviation demanded respect, preparation, and the courage to act when circumstances required it regardless of whether you felt ready. The aircraft logbook entry for that flight included a note added by an FAA inspector after their investigation concluded, stating simply that the successful landing following dual-pilot incapacitation represented extraordinary airmanship under impossible circumstances, that the pilot in command demonstrated skill and judgment far exceeding her age and certification level, that 3 lives were saved through a combination of preparation, knowledge, courage, and proper guidance from air traffic control. That entry became part of the aircraft's permanent record, a testament to the day when a child's voice stunned controllers by saying she had the controls and then proved that sometimes the most unlikely pilots become heroes by simply refusing to give up when giving up would be easiest. Emma kept a photograph from that day on her desk throughout her flying career, showing the Cessna 182 surrounded by emergency vehicles on the runway, a small figure being helped out of the pilot's seat by firefighters whose expressions showed their amazement at who had just landed that aircraft. She looked at that photograph during difficult times, when training seemed overwhelming or when she questioned whether she was good enough to keep pursuing aviation, reminding herself that she'd already faced the ultimate test and passed it not because she was fearless but because she was prepared, not because she had all the answers but because she knew how to find help when she needed it, not because she was invincible but because she cared enough about her parents to try the impossible, rather than accept the certain alternative. The story became part of aviation lore, told and retold in flight schools and cockpits, sometimes embellished but usually staying close to the truth because the truth was remarkable enough without exaggeration. It served as a reminder that heroes came in unexpected packages, that age and experience weren't always prerequisites for competence, that the aviation community could face challenges that seemed insurmountable and sometimes, with the right combination of knowledge, support, and courage, those challenges could be overcome by the most unlikely people rising to meet impossible moments.